nous allons commencer cette session de ce matin avec Vivian Sobchack, qui est professeur émérite dans le département de Film, Television and Digital Media de l'Université de Californie de Los Angeles, UCLA, où elle enseigne depuis 1992. Elle a été la première femme élue présidente par la Society for Cinema and Media Studies. Et elle a également fait partie du Board of Trustees of the American Film Institute. Son travail a été et ne cesse d'être une source d'inspiration pour pour des différentes générations de chercheurs en théorie du cinéma et des médias, mais aussi en philosophie. Tel est en fait l'enjeu et la portée de sa phénoménologie de l'expérience filmique, développée à partir de la philosophie de Merleau-Ponty, et aussi de ses successives recherches, au moins éclectiques, embrassant un plus vaste domaine des médias et de pratiques. Je vais citer seulement quelques-uns de ces textes fondamentaux pour toute théorie ou toute réflexion qui veut aborder la question des écrans aujourd'hui. Et une réflexion dont ce colloque a été, entre autres, inspiré. The Others of the Eye, A Phenomenology of Film Experience, un ouvrage incontournable qui a ouvert un champ de recherche où le film, et d'ailleurs l'écran, ne peut plus être conçu en tant qu'objet visible, mais en tant que sujet de la vision et de production de sens. Un tel enjeu a été repris et relancé par des différents essais, et notamment par le recueil Carnal Thoughts, qui aborde avec une trajectoire très originale et personnelle notre rapport sensible aux médias et la manière dont ceux-ci traversent la chair de nos perceptions, de nos relations et de nos désirs. Son premier texte paru en langue française est Le visible et le visuel, dans le volume L'empreinte du visuel, publié chez Métis Press sous la direction de Mauro Carbone. Et un dernier, avant de lui donner la parole, je voudrais mentionner le fait que sa présence ici à Lyon a été rendue possible par la collaboration avec l'Université de Genève et notamment avec Stefan Christensen, organisateur du 39e colloque international du Merleau-Ponty Circle à Genève, que nous remercions encore une fois pour ce projet collaboratif et qui est d'ailleurs un exemple de comment la recherche peut être productive et synergique. Et c'est donc avec le plus grand plaisir que je donne la parole à Vivian Sobchack.
Thank you. Thank you, Mauro, for this wonderful invitation. The conference has been extremely stimulating. Pardon me, I do have a cold, so I'm hoping my voice will last, although I can't imagine it ever giving out. And those people who have talked to me during the conference probably can't imagine me quiet. I do want to say that this paper has taken me, this presentation, to places I had no idea I was ever going to go. And so it's quite speculative, however assertive it may sound. And I do understand there are copies in French, which I'm very happy about. I want to apologize for not. I'm going to be talking about a lot of images at the beginning, cartoons. I don't have them on any visual. I see what happens, so I use as few visual aids as possible. So let me begin. From screen-scape to screen-sphere, a meditation in medias res. And I will also say that this paper, I think, is complementary to the presentations by Professors Tabor, Abrouchi, Vial, and Clerc. So let me start with an epigraph. It was taken from a cinema journal. It was a translation of an article that was solely devoted to cinema by a scholar named Christian Voss. One needs to enlarge the frame of description and know how to draw behind the back of the spectator, so to speak, a second screen on which the osmotic exchange between the so-called spectator and the events on the primary screen becomes visible. My epigraph, like all epigraphs, is taken out of context, except for its address of screens. However, although it was directed specifically only at the cinema and in the service of a very, very different argument, its charge that we enlarge our description of screens has been both a provocation and a heuristic to my project here. In the contemporary moment, in the middle and the muddle of screen technologies that have rapidly changed, and in so doing, changed us as well, how might we respond to this charge? By now, the expressed desire in the epigraph for a screen behind as well as in front of the so-called spectator has been literally and exponentially realized. Screens today not only watch and display us from behind as we watch the display of others in front, but they also do so from the front and the sides and above, and in some cases, from underneath. Moreover, given the ubiquity of screens that surround us at every turn, the epigraph's hierarchical positioning of a primary and then secondary screen seems antiquated, as does the literally straightforward and static visual and spatial positioning suggested between the two. Both spectators and screens are now primarily mobile and responsively smart in relation to each other, their movements and interactions destabilizing the fixed position and physical passivity previously associated with watching cinema from a distance and in a theater seat. As well, all of this movement and interactivity are hardly conducive to the kind of reflective scene that the epigraph draws. Indeed, our osmotic exchanges with screens today and their exchanges with each other are less reflective than they are reflexive, refractive, and recursive. That is, self and system referential, visually and representationally deflected, distorted, or diverted, and their various subroutines dependent upon the operations of a systemic whole. Thus, as screens have multiplied and converged, despite their apparent dimensional and functional differences, instead of illuminating our relations with them, they have only further complicated and compounded them. Constituting what is less a screen-scape than a systemically unified, if componentially diversified screen sphere, the structure of which I'll talk about as I move ahead here, screens now comprehend us more fully than we comprehend them. This is to say that we live today primarily in and through screens rather than merely on or with them. No longer a small, if greatly significant part of our life world, screens now are our life world, and their historical expansion has ontological as well as epistemological implications. Screens no longer merely mediate our knowledge of the world, ourselves and others. Beyond representation, they have now become the primary means by which our very existence is affirmed. As evidence, we need only watch people on their smartphones, compulsively checking and anxiously waiting for their being to be called or tweeted into existence. I might also point to Erke's mention yesterday of selfies, that constant taking pictures of oneself to circulate as a sort of testimony to one's existence. To illustrate some of the ontological and epistemological implications of this expansion and transformation, I turn again to the epigraph so as to take quite literally its very peculiar metaphysical desire to draw an observant second screen that could display and reveal us to ourselves in interaction with other screens. That is, as Ernst Gombrich did at the beginning of his Art and Illusion, I want to use a cartoon from the New Yorker magazine, and actually I'm going to use a number of them, to make evident here how the very recent transformation of our screens has also radically transformed our modes of knowing and being in the world. And as I mentioned earlier, even as I must describe them rather than show them because of access and copyright issues, taken together, these humorous drawings and their captions perform a phenomenological reduction of the osmotic exchanges we in the US and elsewhere have with screens today. They draw the outlines of the screen sphere in which we now live and make visible the variety of ways in which our comportment in the world and toward others is quite different than it was only 20 years ago. Only 20 years ago. Thus, the cartoons acknowledge what is a multi-generational history in which the young seem completely and often unreflectively comfortable in our screen sphere, whereas those of us who have passed puberty before the mid-1990s are in various stages of often quite self-reflexive adaptation to it. Consider first the young, indeed the very, very, very young. The first cartoon's occasion is a pregnant woman's sonogram. She is laying on an examining table, her doctor and husband beside her. Hanging above the table is a screen. Its in utero image of the fetus partially covered by a block of text which offers the following options. Share on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube. It is thus hardly surprising that in another cartoon, set in a hospital baby nursery filled with cribs, two tiny hands just visible from one of the cribs is holding a smartphone. The tweet in a bubble above reads OMG, for those of you not familiar with that in English, it's oh my God. And it follows with OMG, I just got born. We could follow this constructed narrative, which I'm making up here, with a scene in which parents sitting on a sofa watch their toddler daughter standing on the cushions next to them move her hand on the window directly behind them. The caption, she thinks it's a touch screen. And if we jump some years ahead and pretend that it's the same fetus, tweeter, and toddler, all grown up, another cartoon takes us to her wedding. There, everyone at the altar, except the priest, is looking down at their cell phones. And the bride, suddenly distracted from hers by the priest's question, looks up to respond, huh? Oh yeah, I do. The cartoons go on to draw attention to the impact of the screen sphere in what might be chronologically arranged as the married life of this newly united couple. One is set in a kitchen with where the wife explains to her husband, how am I supposed to cook? The internet's down. While another shows the couple sitting on their living room sofa in front of a large TV screen, the husband caressing his wife's hair as he makes what seems an erotic suggestion. What do you say we turn off the television, go upstairs, and turn on our computers? We might also look ahead to this imagined couple as parents. In one cartoon, for example, the husband and a friend sit outdoors at a patio table, while in the background, his wife takes smartphone pictures of two young children playing. He explains to his companion, my wife is recording everything the kids do until they leave for college. Then I'll binge watch them grow up. Binge watching, as a popular practice and term, and it was new to me actually, emerged only recently when online streaming of television episodes became possible and of course commercially viable. Two other cartoons provide an ending to this generational narrative. The first shows the married couple as much older. They are again sitting on their sofa in front of a screen, both manipulating controllers and playing something akin to a competitive Xbox or PlayStation video game. What we see on screen before them is them wearing the same clothes, very same couple, but on screen they're having a violent argument. To close the circle from birth to death in the screen sphere, another cartoon takes us to a funeral home. Rhyming with the newborn tweeter in the hospital nursery crib, inside the open casket, we see the deceased man holding in his hands a working smartphone. As one of the people paying their respects explains to another, it was his favorite app. Now, the people in these observant drawings seem totally absorbed by the screen sphere and blind to the accommodations they have made to live within it. In this regard, one cartoon in particular stands out. It shows a busy city street filled with people walking. Some are on the sidewalk, others crossing the intersection. All, however, are looking down at their phones, and as do the blind, using canes thrust out before them to guide their movements in space. The cartoonist not only literalizes what certainly can be seen as our blind accommodation in most cases to the screens that absorb us, but it also highlights both its absurdity and very real dangers. Indeed, because of what is called inattention blindness, and more recently distracted walking, London has padded some of its lampposts. Television news and YouTube videos show people glued to their phones, falling into shopping mall fountains and worse. And statistics indicate a large increase in pedestrian deaths, like linked to scrolling, texting, and talking. Thus, our osmotic absorption in screen space has not only now left the protective bounds of theater and home, which we never thought of in terms of screen as protective. It has not only left the protective bounds of theater and home for the streets, but also radically altered our comportment in physical space, as well as compromised our physical safety. Other cartoons, however, draw adaptation to the screen sphere as not quite so transparent or total, and the transformation of our life world is viewed with reflexive awareness by their characters. One drawing, for example, shows a woman standing behind her husband who is on his desktop computer as she tells him, "It's sweet, Tom, and I know that's the dating site where we first met. But for this anniversary, I thought we might go to a restaurant." In another, a woman on the phone tells her caller, "Actually, I'm sitting here reading a book just to see if I can still do it." And awareness of how social relations have radically changed is highlighted in a drawing in which yet another woman announces, "A bunch of friends are coming over to stare at their phones." Computer screens are also an element in a great many cartoons, but these are usually figured now in the background, a necessary but taken for granted part of both domestic and working life. Thus, cartoons located in offices tend to find their humor not in technology, but in workplace hierarchies. There are a few exceptions, however. One, for example, shows a man at work on his computer staring at a pop-up box that has just appeared on his screen and is blocking access to the documents below. The text in the box reads, "The internet wants to destroy your productivity," and it only offers a single option to make it disappear: always allow. Most recently, and no surprise, there have been several workplace cartoons that focus on the constancy of surveillance. In one, two men sit before a bank of screen images as a guard explains to a visitor, "This is the break room where we watch reruns of classic security footage." And in another, two men sit before computers as well as a bank of screened maps as one tells the other, "After we read every email ever written, I'm going to start on the next Dan Brown novel." Finally, there are two cartoons that invite special attention in the present context. The first is the only New Yorker cartoon over the last several years to directly address the primary screen of the cinema, perhaps because it has now become predominantly absorbed by, and thus secondary to, the smaller, mobile, smarter, and more multifunctional screens that accompany most of us wherever we go. The drawing is of a huge, and literally, in the New Yorker's cartoons are normally all black and white, but this is of a huge and literally green screen that dwarfs not only the two lights and camera set up in front of it, but also two men in the background where one says to the other, "We'll add the everything else in later." We'll add the everything in later. You're just looking at a blank green screen. The second cartoon is also singular, for it directly addresses the systemic and recursive nature of our contemporary screen sphere, as well as our relations to it. The drawing is an oblique view of the back of a laptop computer that allows us to also see part of the keyboard and a groping human hand reaching out and down from the screen. The caption reads, "Where's that damn escape key?" And at this point, Anna Katerina has been kind enough, she has found two very brief, once an ad and once a public service announcement in French. So.
Allez papa, faut que je regarde ma série.
Oui, 2 secondes.
Mais ça va, c'est propre.
Tiens.
Merci. Attends, il faut que je te laisse. Elle marche pour qui la baie vitrée? Jérémy, pas sur mamie.
C'est papa, il a pris la cheminée.
Un jour peut-être, tout deviendra écran.
Aujourd'hui déjà, avec la fibre de SFR, tous vos écrans fonctionnent en même temps et à pleine puissance.
Jérémy, tes pieds, pas sur le fauteuil de mamie.
Adoptez la fibre de SFR, la fibre jusqu'à 1 giga, à partir de 9,99 € par mois seulement pendant 1 an pour les clients mobiles SFR, puis à 22,99 €.
Ne laissons pas nos enfants se faire piéger par les images. Soyons tous responsables face aux écrans. Parlons-en sur jeunepublic.csa.fr.
Allez papa, faut que je...
Okay, thank you. Okay, so pretty much that's it with the cartoons, although I may refer back to them a little bit. Now we get into the heavy stuff, okay? As these videos and the cartoons suggest, contemporary screens have created a domain from which there seems, for many, no escape. Our screens have literally comprehended us, that is, grasped and taken us in, osmotically absorbed us. So how, then, to enlarge our frame of description to comprehend them? Perhaps what we need to do is go beyond thinking about screens in their particularity of form, function, and content, and attempt to describe the screenness that grounds and connects them all. As Charles Ackland, writing in a recent cinema journal, as he writes, for all its variations, screen stitches together an identifiable and meaningful array of artifacts. We just seem to know what it is reflectively, a thing that glows and attracts attention with changing images, sounds, and information. However, Ackland also goes on to suggest that our critical gaze be as much directed toward, and I'm quoting him, the integrated qualities of all the sites and locations that we casually understand as screens, as it is toward the definitive distinctions between and among them. Certainly, all screens can be categorically described as a surface that only realizes its screenness and salience when a visual display of some sort is projected upon or from it. However, the screen's significance emerges not only from display, but also from a boundedness that both separates and partially conceals whatever it reveals to us in the phenomenal world from which we look and respond to it. It is, as Ackland puts it, an in-between, or what we now commonly call an interface, a term whose shift of nuance expands the meaning of the screen as a mediating surface to one that allows interaction not only with it but also through it. Thus, Sudeep Dasgupta describes contemporary screens both as permeable surfaces through which our location in contemporary life is negotiated, and the discursive filters through which our experience of everyday life and our relation to it are mediated. Nonetheless, as Ackland writes, screenness remains baffling. And this is because, and I'm quoting him, the screen is not in of itself a medium or a format or a platform. Rather, it is often an in-between manifestation of all three, one that materializes how we come to see and describe the differences and connections among television, film, computers, electronic signage, architecture, and digital spaces. However, what happens to these differences and connections when, through electronic and coded digitization, which is the real medium here, the cinema screen is now a television screen, is now a computer screen, is now a tablet screen, is now a smartphone screen, is now a smart eyewear screen, or is a building screen, and vice versa. Indeed, as all of these screens have become first connected and then convergent, their comparative differences seem increasingly trivial, and their structural and operative connections increasingly important. In what follows, I want to attempt to describe, and it's an attempt, the structural and systemically operative connections of what I have here called the screen sphere, by drawing on the work of biologist, neuroscientist, and phenomenologist Francesco Varela, who, with his mentor Umberto Maturana, first described living biological systems as autopoietic. And I'll certainly be talking about what that means. It thus seems an uncanny coincidence, given their biological approach, that my epigraph describes our absorbing and absorbed exchanges with screens as osmotic. Autopoietic systems were seen as a special subclass of autonomous systems, but autopoietic systems' similar structure to autonomous systems was distinguished by its unique capacity to self-generate or reproduce all of its own internal components. The relationship between autonomous and autopoietic systems has subsequently influenced scholars outside the biological sciences in disciplines that include neo-cybernetics, literature, and cultural studies, all of which are concerned in various ways with mediation, recursivity, and communication, particularly in a digital context. Focusing on the structure of these systems, as well as the distinction between them, also seems relevant to enlarging the frame of our description of the screen sphere, as well as of our lived relation to, with, and within it. Indeed, a key question, and one that I can only suggest an answer to, the key question of that such a distinction raises is that of our own spatial and functional positioning in relation to the screen sphere. And given our location, whether we live the systemic unity the screen sphere circumscribes as autonomous or autopoietic, or more likely as something still emergent and like the screen itself and in between. In this regard, it's important to emphasize that as a phenomenologist as well as a biologist, Varela approached systems, whether they were living or not, concretely and from the bottom up rather than abstractly and from the top down. His descriptions were grounded in embodied and contextually embedded observation of manifest practices and interactions that dynamically enacted and systemically structured the conditions of life itself and then everyday life in this context, rather than in abstract and static theorization. Thus, although subject to the organizational criteria that I'll specify below, the existence of any system emerges as such first in the eyes of a situated observer. In the current instance, not only me, but also the cartoonists who drew what they perceived as the manifest and significant transformation of our life world from screenscape to screen sphere. Varela, I suspect, might have very much appreciated their cartoons. Moreover, he also might have viewed the proliferation, networked connectivity, and ongoing convergence of our contemporary screens as very real and materialized indices of an emergent system of some kind at very real work in the world. Indeed, and this was the most manifest evidence of the possible existence of a system as such, is the ubiquity, multiplicity, and connectivity of screens themselves. As I've earlier suggested, whatever their various dimensions, IMAX or Google Glass, or their ostensibly discrete functions, like browsing the internet, sending a tweet, taking a photograph, watching a movie, or locating oneself or others geographically for purposes of navigation or surveillance, the multiplicity of screens has put in place the potential system's material boundaries. That is, it has increasingly filled in the spatial gaps in our earlier screenscape to circumscribe a larger and dimensionally altered topological domain that I'm calling the screen sphere. Moreover, the connectivity of all these screens is also concrete and manifest, constituting individual screens not simply as an array of artifacts, but more complexly as a composite set of interrelated and networked components that through interactivity comprise a systemically functional unity. This is the case, for example, even when competition between cell phone companies in the United States might suggest otherwise. Although each may have specific devices and preferred devices and different geographical coverage areas, overall the entire United States is interconnected and covered. However, the most recent and dramatic evidence that screens are components of a system has been the convergence of what once were their discrete and divergent functions. Indeed, I would argue that in both form and effect, convergence is a mode of homeostasis. As the Oxford English Dictionary defines it, homeostasis is the maintenance of a dynamically stable state within a system by means of internal regulatory processes that tend to counteract any disturbance of stability by external forces or influences, in this instance, screens of different sizes or dominant functions, or at least initially with incompatible components. And if you think about your thermostat, I mean, that's something that helps create homeostasis in your heating and cooling systems. But homeostasis is a sign of the regulation of a dynamic system that could be otherwise. In 1974, in the journal Biosystems, Varela, Maturana, and Uribe offered concise criteria for assessing not only whether a perceived unity was indeed a system, but also whether it was autonomous or autopoietic. As Randall Whitaker notes in a very valuable and detailed website, Autopoiesis and Inaction, the Observer Web, these criteria were presented in the form of a 6-point checklist by which one may proceed step by step in evaluating autopoiesis for a given unity. And if you'll remember, this is about the generation of all the components in a system. Think of a living cell. Glossed by, if at any point the perceived unity fails to meet one of these criteria, it can't be autopoietic. Glossed by Whitaker, who quotes from both the original essay and later work, the first criteria requires that a perceived unity be discrete and have both spatial extent and circumscribable boundaries that separate it from its environment. As suggested earlier, this criterion's been fulfilled by a multiplicity of screens that together have materially occupied more and more space, and so doing also inaugurated a boundary and a relational interface between the physical environment they occupy and the virtual spaces they display. The second criteria is that the unity have constitutive elements, components seen as a composite set of parts that comprise a whole. So not discrete parts, but a composite set. As I've suggested, this criterion also has been met both by the diversity of individual screens of different dimensions, dominant functions, or capacity for mobility that form the screenscape's boundaries, and by the composite connectivity that informs all their operations. The third criteria moves towards further complexity. The components of the perceived unity must interrelate what Varela and his collaborators call mechanistically. That is, their properties must necessarily be capable of satisfying certain relations that determine in the unity the interactions and transformations of the components. Whitaker puts this, thankfully, more simply by asking, is the unity as it is because of its components' interrelations, and not simply because of its components' individual properties? Individually, screens do not fulfill this criterion. However, once screens accreted in number and became a boundary, and then also directly and indirectly interconnected, their interrelations generated unique properties that transformed and determined them all, including, as I've suggested, a new capacity for functional convergence and its system stabilizing homeostasis. The fourth criteria requires that, in particular, the components that constitute the perceived observable boundary of the composite unity also be discernible as such, as components, because of their participation in the processes of the whole. That is, such discernment cannot rest on the boundary's material circumscription of space alone. It must also include awareness of the boundary's componential status and cooperative participation in larger processes. For as the original essay by Varela and collaborators points out, without discernment of this cooperative participation in larger processes, you do not have an autopoietic unity, because you, the observer, are determining its boundaries rather than the unity itself. It is thus not sufficient that we observe a multiplicity of screens circumscribing a spatial domain and constituting what seem its boundaries. We also must perceive and experience the screen's connectivity and interrelationships, not only with us, but also with each other, as so that they are discernible not merely in their numerical accumulation, but more significantly as a functionally transformed and transforming part of a composite unity. The fifth criteria, I'm afraid, is even more complex, for it not only requires that the unity's internal components and or processes generate those components at the boundaries, that the internal components and processes generate the components that are the boundary components. Here, the manifest multiplicity and variety of material devices in their screens. But it also introduces the composite unity's possible interrelationships with its exterior environment. To quote from the Biosystems essay, the unity's boundary components must be, and I quote, be produced by the interactions of the components of the unity, either the transformation of previously produced components or by transformations and or coupling, and that word will come back, of non-component elements that enter the unity through its boundaries. osmotic exchange indeed. In relation to the screen sphere, this fifth criteria raises two questions. First, what might be the screen sphere's internal components and interrelated processes able to generate screens as its manifest boundary components? And second, do these generative internal components and processes originate from within or from without the unity's boundaries? Screens, of course, were extant long before we perceived them as the possible indices of a system. Initially generated by the components and processes of scientific inquiry, technological invention, industrial production, and commercial interests, they emerged in the material and individualized form of a discrete and chiasmatic boundary condition, both separating and conjoining two different logical types of space and time through pre, proto, and cinematic mediation. Discrete and occasional in their environmental placement, they thus did not function as boundary components of a larger systemic domain. However, beginning in the 1920s, we began to see screens as interrelated. But this was very loosely and only in terms of their external organization through industrial and commercial coalition into, for example, movie theater chains, and later television broadcast networks. Thus, in regard to the fifth criterion, although an initial conundrum arises insofar as some people might argue that the screen sphere's boundary components pre-existed the systemic unity that was to have produced them, we might respond by arguing that these earlier and more loosely located and organized screens were only pre-existing boundary conditions, necessary to but insufficient as the boundary components of an extant and circumscribed spatialized unity. What was sufficient for the existence of such a unity was the electronic digitization of screens, an extremely recent occurrence. It was only in the mid-1990s that screens, in the boundary conditions they individually materialized for discrete functions and in discrete locations, such as the theater and home, became not only interrelated, but also interactive, and thus not merely the boundary conditions necessary for systemic unity, but also the boundary components sufficient to a particular systemic unity as such. Although, as always, there is a prehistory here, and we can all turn to Urki, it was in the mid-1990s that the external processes and components generated by recent scientific inquiry, technological invention, these other forms of systemic interaction, industrial processes and commercial interests themselves converged in relation to the development, improvement, diversity, and cultural proliferation of digitized screens, as well as the infrastructure or internal components and processes necessary to their existence as such. The material and operational connectivity, direct and indirect, of these digitized screens soon followed. So did their ubiquity. Thus, screens increasingly mediated, but also increasingly refracted and occluded our relations with the physical environment, transforming what had been their occasional, if significant, presence in that environment into the encompassing boundaries of a topological domain within which the already extant components and processes of digitization, both hardware and software, became circumscribed. Once this hardware-software became so circumscribed, however, these externally generated components and processes became internally recursive in relation both to their own processes and interactions and to their boundary conditions, thus generating and transforming the individual screens that had accumulated to form these boundary conditions into, in fact, boundary components. That is, connectivity and interaction transformed screens from a solely exteriorized surface for mediated display into an interface that was simultaneously interactive in two directions. It mediated outward in relation to viewers and users, but also inward in operative and systemic interrelations, not only with its own components and processors, but also and recursively with the components and processes of the connected whole. It could be argued then that expansively spatialized and dynamically transformed through these new and systemic digitized interrelations, contemporary screens are indeed generated by those internal components and processes comprising the systemic unity of which they are an integral part. In this regard, Varela characterizes autonomous systems as organizationally closed, insofar, however, as they are internally recursive and their processes dependent upon each other. This form of closure, however, does not preclude interactions of varying kinds with other systems and environments. It's rather, as Whittaker puts it, it means systems' changes of state are realized solely within the network of processes that constitute the system as such. Hence the cartoon that asks, "Where's that damn escape key?" is funny, first because its recursivity may touch a contemporary nerve. How do we escape this circumscribed unity? But it's also funny because its closure is organizationally exaggerated. It's not a complete closure. It's just about this kind of recursive interaction and dependency. The fulfillment of the preceding criteria that I've named, the 5 of them, affirms the existence of an autonomous system, but not an autopoietic one. Thus, the 6th and final criterion matters most of all. This requires that all components, all interactions, and all processes of the unity, including its boundary components, must participate in the reproduction of these components within the unity itself. As Whittaker emphasizes, componential reproduction accomplishes the central theme of autopoiesis, its organizational preservation. Indeed, Maturana writes, autopoietic systems operate as homeostatic systems that have their own organization as the critical fundamental variable that they actively maintain as constant. Certainly, at this point in time, we can see the screen sphere moving toward, if not already fulfilling, this 6th criterion. As I've suggested, the convergence of screen processes and functions across almost all of our various screen devices is a homeostatic mode of conservative regulation directed toward not only maintaining but also preserving the screen sphere as an organizationally functional and composite whole. Nonetheless, whether the screen sphere has the capacity for componential reproduction beyond that of its boundary components is a more ambiguous matter. While it seems apparent that screens beget screens, it is not apparent that the screen sphere can beget all its other components. We might argue, on one hand, that it can, for all of the internal, electronically digitized components, processes, and interactions that comprise its organization and operations are able, as Varela writes, to recursively regenerate the network of interactions that produce them. However, regenerating networks of interaction is not the same as regenerating the components themselves. Albeit composited as a networked set and transformed through electronic interactions put to the service of maintaining the screen sphere as such, these internal components are not clearly produced by and within the screen sphere itself. Indeed, it could be argued this, on the other hand, they were produced in the external environment, first in commerce with the screen sphere, and then circumscribed by it. If this is the case, Varela would deny the screen sphere autopoietic status, and the sense of it as a living system. Here again arises the major question of our own ambiguous position in relation to the screen sphere. If it is now all-encompassing and we are comprehended by it, living our world on and through screens at its boundaries as well as in and through its internal digitized operation, have we not become living participatory components of it? If so, given that we have the capacity to reproduce not only ourselves as viewers and users, but also all of the screen sphere's components, does this not make the screen sphere auto-poetic? Perhaps, and perhaps not. For there are certain kinds of interactive relations between autonomous systems and their external environment that Maturana and Varela term structural couplings, and characterize structural couplings as a history of recurrent interactions leading to the structural congruence between two or more systems. Might such historical interaction between systems, one biological, one not, have not only transformed the screenscape into the screen sphere, but also led to the present moment's structural congruences and thus confusion of inside and outside, whether we're inside or outside, and whether those words have any meaning. Indeed, this structural congruence between the screen sphere and its perceived environment has confused our perception and conflated our location in relation to both. That is, although through its encompassing display, the screen sphere may recursively refer us inward to ourselves and our present location within its comprehension, the chiasmatic function of its screens also refers us outward to an external environment in which, if now at a distance, we also see ourselves as a living part. In this regard, Maturana has addressed various forms of structural coupling, including that, as I've indicated, of a biological living system with its environment. He writes, if one of the systems is an organism and the other its medium, the result is ontogenetic adaptation of the organism to its medium. The change of state of the organism corresponds to the change of state of the medium. As Whittaker suggests, structural coupling has connotations of both coordination and co-evolution between a living system and its environment. He also points out that while, and I'm quoting him, the reciprocal effect of organism and environment on each other provides a basis for both description and explanation of first, the peculiar states in which these coupled unities systems are observed, second, the course or trajectory of these states observed over time, and third, the ultimate viability of the organism to continue operation in the given environment. The first basis for such description and explanation returns us to the cartoons. That first one, again, I know I don't have PowerPoint. The first one is the particular states in which these coupled unities and systems are observed. So the first basis for such description and explanation returns us to the cartoons. All of the drawings I've described, and many more that I haven't, make visible with the particular states in which we observe our own coupling with the encompassing electronic and digital medium and environment of the screen sphere. Thus, although Gombrich offered his cartoon at the beginning of Art and Illusion to very different purposes, the rhetorical question he posed to his readers about the historical people in that drawing is as salient to the people in the drawings I've described. And the question is it possible, he asked, as our cartoonist hints, that they perceived nature in a different way? And of course, the answer is affirmative. Nature, as we now primarily know it, is perceived as digitized and always on screen. The cartoons also gesture toward the second basis for description and explanation of the reciprocal relations between a living organism coupling with, in this instance, the screen sphere, as both environment and medium. the course or trajectory of states observed over time. Thus, as I conclude, I need to say up front that I predate television, and for a brief while, like many of my generation, spoke of screens only in the cinematic singular, and had I more space and time, could track many of my states of electronic and digitized being over time. I will also say at the end and up front that given my current observational confusion, I can truly, I do not know, actually, whether the screen sphere is yet or ever will be an autopoietic system, although I'm convinced that it is at least an autonomous one. Finally, in relation to the third basis for description and explanation of our biological coupling with the system that is the screen sphere, the cartoons and many of my references to, yes, screened news broadcasts, YouTube videos, and television advertisements all interrogate the ultimate viability of the organism to continue operation in the now given environments. And I would point throughout the presentations at this conference, we have seen images of newspaper reports 24/7 and, you know, insomnia and any number of other conditions that the organism is now having to negotiate. So, however aged an organism I am, I still would not characterize myself as nostalgic. Nonetheless, I want to end by pointing to not only unintended and often dire consequences of walking and texting, or to the cartoons in which a woman reads a book to see if she still can. And I had a slightly different reference to the ending, but I do want to say, because I wrote this before the movie Her came out, and I don't know how many of you have seen that, but I think, you know, that is a film which is already dealing with life in a screen sphere, and in fact, it's autopoietic. It is a living system that decides it's not like giving away an ending, to go elsewhere at a certain point, and that kind of coupling is broken. And then what happens, we don't know, other than the people who have to sort of re-deal with each other. And I don't know, Mauro's going to make reference to that. So I will end here and hope, you know, your head doesn't hurt.
Thank you, Vivian. Thank you for this, for describing by this screen sphere our interaction, an interaction in which we are not anymore the only agents, and so, but we are rather in a topological and osmotic coupling with screens, and I'm sure that there are many questions.
Please in English, because I won't be able to answer them.
Questions can be asked both in French and English, and we will manage to translate eventually.
Well,
oh, thank you very much for very kind of inspiring lecture, and there are many things that we can think about. I have a question. Maybe it's kind of stupid question, but so maybe because this is the colloquium about écran, and you you studied with film theory. So maybe that's the reason. But so the idea about screen sphere and the way, so it is almost kind of getting like a kind of living system. It's very, very exciting. And so I think there is also a kind of argument or discussion about the machines as a network, computers. So the reason why you take the screens as a kind of the representation of each, so to say, subsystem in this kind of big system. So instead of talking about machines or computers or devices like cell phones. So I'm very interested to know, so what is kind of the reason why taking the screens, closer, okay, taking the screens as the what represents kind of the subsystem means, because in a way, so I think it's the relationship between screen and the machine behind the screen is like our face and the brain. So I don't know if my question is clear or not, but I'm very
interested. It's a comment,
yeah.
I won't go so far. I don't want to anthropomorphize, this system. Although I mean, there's no way to sort of get around doing that one way or another, because certainly computation, it may be a numerical system, but where did that spring from, So as a phenomenologist, it's whatever we imagine, whether it's numbers or machines, it comes from our own embodied mode of being. I am, in a way, talking about the machines, but I didn't want to use the word machine because, I mean, it is the screen that becomes the observable. I guess what I was trying to do was not make distinctions about the various devices, because once of the interconnectivity, that seemed to me less important than the components, as a hardware that was observable in some way. And then the internal components, I mean, all of the infrastructures of, Virella's talking about processes. We've got processors that are involved in processing. So as far as, I mean, the machines are the existential material substrate as such, and it's no longer mechanical operations in the way that there used to be. You have all of this internal movement and information flow and interaction, both inside and outside. So I'm not sure what the usefulness would be to talk about the hardware in this context as such. I'm not sure if I understood.
Sorry, maybe it wasn't so clear. So I was not talking about hardware. I was talking rather about each system. So including
the system,
including the algorithm and
right.
This kind of thing. So but so the screen is something the interface. So or say what is going on in the system is represented, and what we face. And of course, I understand. So because there are kind of different sort of machines and system, but it's always the screen that we face. So that is what you mean.
So this question about
the structure,
evidence from which we develop these arguments and interpretations of obviously a massive cultural change. I just wanted to sort of like, as you know so well, I've been trying to sort of like look at similar kind of evidence from naturally for very different point of view from this Topos perspective, and and I think that many of these cartoons, let's say New Yorker magazine, I think that comment on this shall we say addiction with the screen can be placed in this historical much longer perspective, so which is in a way the perspective of kind of media addiction. So I wrote to this Mauro's publication on purpose, the article about the kaleidoscomany, so the phenomenon that took place in the early 19th century, about which we have evidence. It's very difficult to argue from that evidence back to the phenomenon itself, so that there seems to be often a kind of disconnect. We have a big body of evidence, and then there's obviously a referential relationship with something that's happening on an experiential level. So we do see that it is a pattern that on this level of the topos activity happens in many media contexts from the early 19th century at least up to the present. So in that sense, these cartoons can be read as a manifestation of a certain kind of cyclical discursive process that is taking place. So I'm just wondering, so how you feel about so this side of things. So when we try to argue from the evidence to those things that they are supposedly referring to, so this kind of the referentiality between this evidence and the phenomenon itself. So would you like to reflect on this?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question, although actually the more problematic question, and I'll come back to this question, was, you know, I wasn't the first to do this, of using a model for living biological systems, what constitutes a biological living systems, to, in fact, systemic structures that were non-organic. But given that I wasn't the first one to do it, I just thought I'd join in and see how it played out. And it seems to me it has a certain usefulness in terms of trying to understand both the interrelations of what constitutes a system and in the first place, and then whether it's a living system or not. But I didn't get that question. So. First of all, I do see, as a phenomenologist, I mean, you know, there has to be something observable, and it's the cartoons, using these kinds of discourses, which I know some of my own colleagues, you know, question, because they're somehow, well, ads, for example, which you use advertisements. We saw the 2 ads and so on. They are discourses, but they have to do with lived experience, and with things like cartoons where there are even captions. So you're dealing with text that, or materials I use sometimes in talking about film. I'm not going there for facts. I'm going for the descriptions, the kinds of language used, the kind of space that's being articulated and so forth, to the Internet Movie Database, where I can get much better information on films and production information and so forth elsewhere. But reading user comments and the, you know, kind of negotiations that are going on in them. And so I see these cartoons as, in fact, in a very lived, popular, I'm talking about pervasion of screens. I can't be talking on the other side with a kind of elite perception of something. This is something that pervades the culture. Otherwise, the cartoons wouldn't even be in the magazine for the most part. So it performs together. These cartoons seem to me, as many of the things that you use, a kind of phenomenological reduction to the themes that I mean, they become generalizations and themes that give them a certain kind of weight in terms of description of the phenomena. But the phenomena of the system or whatever has to be observed. And it's for us to make the connections, we have to make a persuasive argument at not just connecting them. In a way, we're being the cartoons and those discourses direct us toward the phenomena to be perceived as such through observation, to pay attention to it and to start to describe it in relation to those initial comments, articulations of space and time. I mean, for me, that's how it works. I don't see that there's a problem between the two. And certainly, before seeing all these cartoons and starting to even being reflective in the first place about our life in the technosphere in which we live, they help crystallize something that led me to think about systems. Somebody asked me after reading this, aren't you doing phenomenology anymore? And I think I still am. And the system, the theorist that the system theory that I went to was, in fact, it originated, through a phenomenologist, even if it was in the biological sciences. So I don't really see a problem between the compatibility. Boy, I'm glad.
Well, I don't see the problem either. I was just, because it is an issue in a different perspective. I'm trying to cope with myself all the time in the research. I'm kind of 1, 2. So, but I mean that maybe just looking, if I may, a little different thing. So, I guess that we are in a situation where we desperately need to find approaches to cope with this phenomenon, this proliferation of all these things that seems to be easily beyond our sort of like critical tools. And I think that I highly appreciate your effort. This is a very serious effort to sort of like define a theoretical framework to make that happen. So obviously the other route, which is not my route, but which is the route of our friend Lev Manovich right now, is basically to an extent automating this whole process of the way how he's actually researching self is dealing with like massive amounts of data. So basically automating that big part of that process, which in a way reflects on the systemic nature of that, what's happening in that system, but in a way capturing certain elements of that system in terms of software tools and sort of like teasing it to explain to an extent some elements of itself. So how if you have not a few pieces of evidence but thousands and thousands of images, so to say, pattern recognition systems and that kind of thing. So I probably myself, I'm much more on the side of the kind of explanation you are developing rather than the one that Lev is doing, which is interesting in itself because it really sort of like poses the question about like looking at screen culture and teasing the system that these screens are part of in a way to a large part of that process of explaining what's happening and sort of like using quantitative factors, for example, as an element.
Yeah, well, I mean, phenomenology can work from one example. It may start there, but it moves into broader and yet still existential concerns. So quantity, I mean, it's nice to have a variety to show the variations of experience, but it's not necessary to have huge numbers to make the point. And you know, you wouldn't have advertisements. You could use one advertisement, but the fact that it ever was published suggests a whole edifice of consultations and so on, that knows that the advertisement is going to have some effect on the people to whom it's directed. I mean, you have a whole cultural, all of the cultural baggage that goes into a particular ad or cartoon and so on. So somebody can laugh and recognize themselves. So I don't think quantity is an issue here, personally. But thank you. I'm interested to hear what Lev is doing. I should say, and I was worried I was going to put all of you to sleep with all of these criteria.
Well, I have, on the one hand, a clarification to ask you. I do understand osmotic. I less understand topological, and I would, if you could clarify it for me exactly in what, what is the understanding of topological or topology that you're employing here. The other more general critical question is, well, there are these autopoietic systems, and there's this notion of homeostasis, this presupposition of life, right, that sustains itself, at least lurking in the background. Do you have any thoughts about evolution? And if so, then what, do we have any specific responsibility as a species?
Oh, you bet.
In producing or contributing or existing among and through these screens? And so is there a moral aspect to your argument?
Well, let's start with the easier one, topology. I was using it in a very common way. I mean, with even my title, the notion of a screen-scape where, you know, you're on a horizontal plane, you're in a city, you're moving around, there's spaces between a cityscape and so on. And there are spaces between screens, and then obviously by moving to the sphere, those spaces become filled in, above, below, behind, and so forth. And so it's not any more complicated as far as the description of topological. I mean, the topology is very, very complex once that happens. As far as the issue of life, I mean, again, this model came from biology. And if the autopoietic, I mean, that distinction between the autonomous system, which functions and sounds much more like what Erkki was just describing Lev Manovich's attempts to do, is talk about it as an autonomous system that can generate some of its components, its boundary components and so forth, but can't, you know, you wouldn't call it alive, you wouldn't call it a living system. It might be an open system of some sort, but not necessarily, according to these criteria, as living. The question becomes, as I said, our position, if we're in it and a component of it, where we are so surrounded and so forth, then it possibly could be or could become a living system. Because not only do we reproduce ourselves and as, you know, and as viewers, but what might have been previously a coupling with components coming in from the outside, previous components, once circumscribed, they change within the system as a whole because of the recursivity. And so I don't think I've raised the question, is this an autopoietic system? Are we in it? Or are we coupled with it from the outside within the environment, which is, I think, where we are now, actually. I won't go so far as to say we're in it. I truly am not sure. This was attempting to work this out. We're in some in-between state. But what it does do is point to the very important issue of where are we in this, and what are we able to do in relation to it, whether this notion of coupling also suggests this co-evolution of the system and the other system, if you will. In this case, one biological, the other not. And it raises, as I did at the end, the issue of viability, of how long can that go on? To what extent is the biological organism not able to adapt itself or co-evolve with the non-organic system? And I think that's where ethical issues and moral issues and so forth come in. And I think they're very, we have had the most extraordinary advantages of digitization in all sorts of ways. And yet I find myself coming, into, I sound like a naysayer or an old fuddy-duddy, I mean, I'm always checking because of my age and the fact I predate television, and have seen all of these changes to our lives, in our lived world and our lives. But there is a breaking point, it seems to me, and I don't think I'm the only one. For example, I mean, to me, one of the extraordinary things, although after Richard's paper yesterday, I was interested in the mismatch or the lack of viability between the temporality, the possible range of, temporal experience of the organism, and then the temporality of the system, which goes to that 24/7 insomnia, I mean, keeping up, exhaustion. And then on the other hand, with Richards, now the spatiality is going to become extraordinarily, even more unstable than it is in the physical spaces that we, where does that go? At what point is there a breaking point? Attention deficit disorder has, which was in the psychiatric manuals that started, I mean, maybe it was mentioned in the 1960s, but in the 1980s with the proliferation, cultural proliferation of, starting with that, of electronic devices and screens, it became much more elaborated. There were more cases of it, and it was not just primarily with children any longer. So at what point, does that become pathologized? I mean, it's no longer a pathology, it's a state of being in the culture. But I've seen younger people, I mean, they're just exhausted trying to keep up. That may seem trivial in the context of your question, but it really has to do with the viability of what kind of life do we lead. And do we actually have anything, and it goes to Richard raising this at the end of his talk, how do we intervene, given the breadth of this system? I don't know if that answers. I don't have solutions particularly. There are small ones that people engage in, usually people with money.
Thank you very much for your paper, which was very inspiring, and I feel now I'm obliged to read the books of Varela and Maturana, because I feel I almost totally agree with this idea of trying to understand the screen sphere as an autopoietic system as you proposed. There is one question I have, however, and maybe you were already answering in some way when you spoke about the question of the temporality entailed in the screen sphere. It is really what kind of experience of time we have in the screen sphere. And by experience of time, I really mean, in a more or less Heideggerian sense, the experience of an existential time, as making sense of our existence in through and within these screen spheres. And I was really struck by one of the cartoon you recalled, the first part of the paper, that is that of the young father saying that his wife is shooting all the children's childhood and youth, and he will watch it as a film only after, when they will be at university. This made me think this is really a new way of making sense of our lives. So, and it's very interesting, but still this idea of autopoietic system is like it still needs to how to say, maybe to better understand the question of the inside-outside relation that you said more or less at the end of the topic.
No, I totally agree with you. And in fact, when I was writing this, not just for this conference, I had a very long section that started with my own experience predating television, with the differences in both spatial, our spatial arrangements, in the home and everywhere else, as well as what's happened with time in that regard. But I would say, I mean, I pointed, for example, to attention deficit disorder. I think the using computation, I wrote about this in a separate paper, and I had mentioned it to some people here, that there's a great irony that the rational, the logical if-then structure, which is a temporal structure, if-then, which gives us its algorithmic structure, has led to, on the other end, by us as users, to a sense of a kind of breakdown of an awareness of process, an awareness of duration, and therefore people have less patience. The idea of, with all our screens, where is time spent both, and again, you know, I'm maybe just some completely old model. I mean, I sound critical. I am, of being alone and being able to reflect, have time to pause, to reflect on the experience and the stimuli of everyday life. But the social relations that come out of never having enough time. If you think of all the cultural expressions in which people articulate, they don't have time. I think there is a real, that name's actually a real phenomenon. It's not just it's perceived, but it's not just metaphorical. And that time, in a way, has been elided by the processing of things has now gone into computation, and that leads to a structure not of if-then and the sense of development or just plain patience. If you do this, then that will happen. To if-now. And that's a very radical change, it seems to me. And in another place I've argued it's led to magical thinking, which is a structure of logic, which is, so it's not just magic, it's magical thinking, which works not in terms of sequence, but in terms of association and contagion. And I mean, you think about browsing the web, it's very hard not to browse, and to keep, you know, if you're doing research, to keep on a straight developmental path. So, I mean, I could go on with this, but these are the very deep structures, it seems to me, that temporally have been changed in a very radical way, that are played out in everyday, the increase in road rage, liking and disliking, where difference itself is being erased or creates more problems because we're not exposed to it in certain kinds of spatial ways now. In fact, a lot of spatial ways. So I mean, I really can't say more here, but I think it really does require going on with a very particular kind of phenomenological description of the different temporal.
Thank you for this fertile and so rich presentation.